Okay, so last week we sort of completed part of a sugya which we were going to pick up today, but the Gemara transitions in this whole discussion of whether or not one can the machlekes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. We transitioned to the question of whether or not an inheritor can go into the property of a captive. What we loosely describe a captive, meaning someone who owns property here but is not here now, and can help tend to the property so that it does not go into destruction, which is part and parcel of the Mishnah that we are talking about in terms of whether or not the machlokes between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, whether mafkid peiros, you can actually, that goes with someone who actually used someone as a shomer. So the Gemara wanted to make a comparison between that Mishnah and the Brisa talked about a shavui, about a captive. So that's kind of where we transitioned last week, and that's what we're going to pick up right now, is to go further into the discussion of a shavui, so that we understand shavui and how that affects or plays off our Mishnah. So now we're going to focus a little bit on shavui, and we are right in the middle of the large lines. If you see Uvda ben Ardoy, it's a little bit below that.
The Lamed Ches Amud Beis.
I'm sorry, Lamed Ches Amud Beis, right? Lamed Ches Amud Beis, where the Gemara concluded, in this part of the Gemara, we concluded that we compared it to a pasuk in the Torah, where the Torah says that the Ribono Shel Olam punishes those who oppress Yisomim, Almonos and Yisomim, and then repeats a second time that they can have no chelik. So the Gemara asked Kasha, we know that if you're punishing them, then they can't have any chelik in the property of the parent, of the person who did the oppression. So the Gemara wants to conclude from that to show not you get a double punishment. You get a punishment by Lamazeb, which is Misa, but you also get a punishment that the property can never be inherited by the wife, the Almona and the Yisomim, and therefore you're punished twice. And from that second drasha, we learn that you cannot tend to the property of someone. Again, the Gemara wants to make that heckish. You can't enter into the property of someone who is a shavui, because there's something about his character that is not kahagun, and therefore you can't inherit him. In other words, you can't do anything his property, and it's lost to everybody. That's how powerful the punishment is. So that's how the Gemara wanted to conclude that. Now, so we came. That's the conclusion we came to. That just like in the pasuk here too, you can't enter into the property. Now, so the Gemara is going to start umoridin. That's the second to last line, maybe about 10 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara says, umoridin karov miyado. I'm sorry, marivin karov lenichse shavui. The principle of allowing a karov, and we only talk about krovim. We're not talking about strangers. We're talking about people who have theoretically the right to the property. In other words, in the normal course of events, we say that a person would want his inheritor, whoever it is, to take over his property. So when the Gemara clears all of this, it's not saying, let's let a stranger in to tend to the property to make sure that it's in good shape. No, the Gemara wants to tell us that this is the norm. A karov, whether it's a son or a cousin or a nephew or someone in the family who you would want to tend to the property, should be the one to come in. So this whole discussion is only about a karov, only about someone who would otherwise have rights to the property, not a stranger. Says the Gemara, Maritin karov l'nichse shavui tanoihi. This whole concept of allowing a karov into the property of a shavui, of a captive, or someone who is not here right now, tanoihi. It's a machlokes tanoi. It's not just a discussion among Moiroim, but really goes to the very heart of the discussion in Samachat tonight. What is the machlekes? The Tanya, because we learned in the Brisa, Hayara the Nitzay Shavui, the Brisa says if someone enters without discussion or permission, the Nitzay Shavui, a Mutzian Osa Miyado, we do not tell him to leave and we don't take it out of his hand. In other words, if someone, let's call it abandoned, not abandoned, but he was captured in a loose sense. He was captured, or he's not here, and so someone says, I've got to take responsibility. I'm a karev. I've got to come in and I've got to tend to this property so that it shouldn't go awry. So says this machlekes in this brisa. So the brisa says that he can do it. Below owed, not only can he do it, ela afilu shama shemish mashmashin, uboin v'konin v'talush. Even if he heard, there was a rumor. Let's just say there was a rumor that something happened to him, right? That he was not able to come back. No, I'm sorry. The opposite. Even if we heard a rumor that he is coming back. In other words, what's the whole point of your coming into the property is to tend it because you don't know the status of the shavui, but you hear a rumor that he's overseas and then he's making his way back. So l'chayra, the pressure of this karev coming into the property has now lessened. So, and this karev said, you know what? I'm not going to wait for him to come back. I'm going to harvest the entire produce. In other words, it's already mature, and he has to wait for him to come back. And he says, I'm not going to wait. So v'kodem v'talish v'achal harizeh zorez v'nishkar. He is entitled. In other words, he acted quickly, and says the Gemara, we don't say, wait a minute, you're now overstaying your responsibility because you heard he's coming back. He's allowed to come back. So what do we hear from this? We hear from
excuse me, Rabbi. So he's eliminating the opportunity for the owner to use this for mice or something. He's taken away some of the
the whole
options of the owner.
Right.
So
that's one time. In other words, in this machlekes tanoim, one Tana says, we'll see what it is in a minute. One Tana says he can come in, sweep in, take it all out because he has the right. Even if he knows that the guy's going to be back at a point in time and will salvage some of it, he still has that right.
Why doesn't this karev know that it's not so simple? If he's a learned karev, he should know that this is taking away options from the owner.
Exactly right. But this man d'Amr, this Tana, who we will name in a minute, says yes, he's allowed to do that. He's allowed to jump in here and basically take over the property and do what he needs to do, even if it is to the detriment somehow of the owner. Right. So Rashi says,
if he comes back, if the owner comes back during the time he's doing that, doesn't he have to pay the owner for it? It's only if he does it before the owner gets back. Is that correct?
If he does it before the owner gets back, right.
Then he can keep it.
So let's look at Rashi. The Talish, Perish Shanazu, he literally harvests the entire Paris for that year. Harizes Zoris. So the Gemara uses the words he's a Zoris. He's Rizus. He does Rizus. Maher Liskos Bishalo. He is hurrying to be Zeicha of what belongs to him because he's a Karev. Beterem Yifsad Benishkar Bizrizaso. So in other words, we praise him in his Rizus that he quickly went and took what would belong to him. And even though we hear that the owner is going to come back, this man the Omer says it's okay what he did. So all your questions are going to have to hold a second, because this man the Amr says it's okay for him to do that. Okay, fine. Now let's hold it. Says the Gemara. What is nichsa shvuyim? What are we really talking about? So says the Gemara. Harei shahaya aviv o achiv o echad min hamorishin holchu lahem lemedinas hayam. His father, his brother, or any other person who he would inherit. So you go through the list, of who he's entitled to inherit, and that person went lemedinas hayam in the classic sense. That's what we're talking about. Now, this is important, and we hear that he died. So remember, in those days, when someone went on a ship and he went overseas, there was no mail, there was no phone, there was no wireless. You had to rely on people who were maybe going back and forth between, let's say, the continent or wherever, and it took a long time for news to travel. So you were in the dark. So when this person left, the thought was that he died, that he's not coming back. Why? Because he's gone, and they figure that, there's not going to be a return trip. So what the Gemara is telling us is that when those circumstances come together, the person who is going into the property is a Yerush. He's absolutely a Yerush, and he hears that the person who owns his property has left, and he hears and assumes, or he hears through some rumor, nothing definitive, that he died. So what is he to do? So basically he says, I have no choice. I'm going to take this property, I'm going to clean it up, I'm going to harvest it, it's my property, and I'll do what I have to do as if I were the one sitting in ownership and there's no one else to consult. So that's how the Gemara understands what this definition of shvuyin is, and therefore that Tana says, what choice do we have? You got to give it to him, and he can take everything, and there is no question that it belongs to him. Now, let's stop a minute. Why is this even a question? You remember that last week we raised the outside question that a karov who comes into a property, who believes that the owner is going to come back, so there's a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, whether or not this karov is, I won't say the real thing, but whether or not he takes it upon himself and says, I better take what I can get, because when the owner comes back, I get nothing. And we worry that this karov will destroy the property. How will he destroy the property? Because in his haste to get everything he can, he's not going to follow the protocol of letting the property lie fallow and do what's in the best long-term interests of the property, but he's going to try to take from the property as quickly as possible what he can, and thereby destroy the property. Because what we know, basically, even if we don't know agriculture, we know that a property, to be maintained properly, has to be irrigated, it has to be rested, it has to lie fallow. Everything that we do, shviyah, shmita, all these things are practical answers to how you create longevity for a property. But he's going to say, according to this machlokes of Rav and Shmuel, wait a minute, I better jump in here and get what I can. So in point of fact, even though it's a karov, we worry that he will take the property. Now, the alternative is if he says, no, I'm going to do the right thing for the property, because I know, al pi halacha, that even if the owner comes back, I am entitled to a certain sort of salary as an orov. I'm entitled to certain monies because I took care of the property. So I'm not worried that I'll be compensated. That's the machlokes Rav and Shmuel. So in this particular case, where he hears, wait a minute, the guy left, my Yerush left, the guy who I'm going to inherit left, and I think he died. What am I worried about? He's not coming back. I don't have to do anything unusual to the property. I'm just going to let it go the way it's supposed to go, because I'm now the new owner. So that's pshat in this definition of shvuyim, is that we understand that the owner's gone. And if the owner's gone, says the Gemara, that everybody agrees we allow the Korov to come in because we're not worried that he will do something bad to the property because he's now the new owner and he has no reason to hasten the property's sort of demise or destruction. So he'll just let it go the way it goes and we won't worry about it. So that's now the definition of shvuyin. That's how we understand the Gemara understands shvuyin. Okay, we haven't gotten to the machlokes yet. We're still sort of setting it up. All right, so that's part one. Now the Gemara goes and tells us besides shvuyin, there's something else. Hayored l'nichsei netushim. There's something called netushim. Netushim means abandonment. Okay, in the case of the shavui, he didn't abandon the property. He picked himself up, went to Medina Sayyam, and we know that his Yerush has certain rights when he left the property. Now, the Gemara wants to give us a different scenario and says, if someone goes into the what is called abandoned property, and again, here we have to make a decision, a distinction between two types of abandonment. Forced abandonment or voluntary abandonment. So the Gemara says that netushim in this particular case means forced abandonment. Okay, if someone goes into a property that was forced to be abandoned, motzian oso miyado, we take it from his hand. What does that mean? That means we do not allow, whereas we said with the shavuyim, we allow him to come in and we allow him to set up and to take care of the property. Here, if someone comes into the nifsa metushin, then we don't allow. What is the definition of netushim? The elahei nichse netushim. What is nichse netushim? The same thing. His father, his brother, or one of the people that he's likely to inherit. He went to Medina Sayyam. Below shamu behem shemes. Big distinction. In the case of Shavui, we hear that he died by rumor. So we said the guy can come in and take over because the fellow isn't coming back. In the case of Netushim, we don't hear anything. He picked himself up and he left. Now, what's the question? Why should this person not be allowed in? Okay. The answer is because, in principle, when a person leaves his home, his possession, his property, he should make certain designations. He should go to the Bezdin and say, the Bezdin, you know what? I'm about to leave, and I'm not going to leave this hefker. So here's what I want to happen. In those days, Bezdin was the right address. So they go to Bezdin and you say, my nephew from my wife's side or my whoever it is, Reuven should be my inheritor, and I want him to come in and take the property. Says the Gemara, since he did not designate, we, the Bezdin, don't step into his shoes and say, we're going to designate. In other words, in the case where he picked himself up and left, and we don't know his status, we assume that he didn't want anybody to come in. That's how the Gemara interprets Netushim. And we don't know that he died. So in other words, for all we know, he just went on a long trip, didn't tell anybody, he's going to come back and doesn't want anybody to step in. So that's what the Gemara says is the definition of Netushim. Okay, now there is a third. Okay, V'Omer Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rab Shimon ben Gamliel says. So now, here we're going to get to this discussion. Comes Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, and he says, "Shamati shenetushim kishvuyin." No, I heard. In other words, my shita is that netushim is kishvuyin. So this is the machlokes of Tanoim that the Gemara said earlier. Tanoihi is the machlokes which is parallel to our Mishnah between the Rabbanan and Rab Shimon Gamliel, whereas Rabbanan take a hard line and say that there is no inheritor. Comes Rab Shimon Gamliel and he says, "Shomati, I heard my shita shenetushim kishvuyim, that netushim are like shvuyin, And what? It says Rashi, Ein Motziyim Miyado. In other words, to me, the fact that he didn't say anything and just left the property without saying a word does not disqualify the inheritor from coming in, and he can come in and take care of the property. Now, let's get back to what's the underlying concern? The underlying concern, which was the machlokes of Rav and Shmuel, is that, what do you mean you're going to let him in? He's going to destroy the property. He's going to eat up the property. He'll take advantage, and there will be no, it'll destroy it. You won't do the normal things you do on a property. Says Rav Shimon Gamliel, basically, that's not going to happen. Why? Because this Yairish, sure, he doesn't hear from the owner, and he thinks he may be the owner, but he has enough going that he says, you know what, I'm going to do what I have to do. If somehow this owner comes back, because I haven't heard from him, I know I'm going to be paid like an Arif. And that is okay, that's not being full ownership, but I know I'm going to get my share. So I'm not going to destroy it. In other words, I'm not going to sort of grab everything right away to destroy the property in the event that he comes back, because I know I have confidence that I will be paid in the long run. So that's Rav Shimon Gamliel's shita. Therefore, he says that Netushim, in fact, are like Shvuyin, and you do not, but you don't let him in. But at the same time, he's comfortable with the fact that in the long term, he's gonna go get his. All right. So and this is the machlokes between the Tanakama Rabbanan and Shimon Gamliel, whether or not Netushim you let him in. According to the Rabbanan, you don't let him in because we worry about the Korov taking advantage. And according to Shimon Gamliel, we do let him in because we say that he's sanguine enough to know that something will come to him. Either he'll get his total ownership or he'll get his proper share, which the halacha says that's what you have to give him. So he's not worried.
Rabbi,
yeah.
Excuse me, aren't they guessing the mentality of this other person? I mean, there's no evidence for either one of the answers.
Correct, and that's why Rabbi Shimon Gamliel makes the assumption that that in the norm, a person who leaves and doesn't announce anything and just goes away, but we don't know anything about his status, that he will, again, he's making the assumption, you're right, we don't know this with certainty. He's making the assumption that that person will do the right thing for whoever is in the property. A, you have to let him into the property, number one. And B, if he takes care of the property, he'll have a korsa. But that's the essence of the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel, where Rav says, I don't trust him. I mean, if he didn't announce it, that means he didn't want it. In other words, you can look at it two ways and say, you have a choice. You abandoned the property. You could have said, my nephew, you're a good guy, take care of my property while I'm gone. And he would have had that opportunity. Okay, he would have had that opportunity. So if he has that opportunity and he doesn't do it, you should make an assumption that he doesn't want it to happen.
But if the Beis Din lets him in,
yeah,
why shouldn't they take on the responsibility to monitor? Because if he's doing the wrong stuff, then the Beis Din can throw him out. I mean, they have a responsibility not to follow through
right,
to some extent, and I would assume monitoring would be a normal thing for Beis Din to do.
Right. So
well, I think part of it though may be that this idea is that this is somebody who's a Yoresh, and so therefore it would be in their interest to do the right. If it's just some random person off the street trying to possibly take advantage of the situation, or
right,
possibly just being a good guy, that's one thing. But a Yoresh would have the incentive to do the right thing, because if the owner comes back in 6 months or in a year or whatever and takes over again, if the place is ruined, he's going to end up being written out of the will, so to speak.
The Beis Din still, I assume, has a responsibility, because this Yoresh can turn out to be the wrong guy, and the Beis Din should throw him out, even though he started.
Right.
They let him in, he's not doing the right stuff. They have a responsibility to throw him out.
Right. I think that's baked into the machlokes. In other words, the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel inherently has to make an assumption. Does the Beis Din allow him in because they will be on top of it? You're right. They're going to be on top of it. They're going to see. and they're gonna see that nothing is bad, or is the assumption, wait a minute, the Besdin's got enough going on. If they're gonna allow him in, then he's a Yerush, you do your thing. The Besdin's too busy with other things to necessarily monitor every single one. Therefore, we can't trust him. Therefore, we can't trust him.
But that shouldn't get Besdin off the hook. Once they make a decision to allow this thing to happen, I would assume they have certain responsibilities.
Well, that's why that Mandomer takes the position that Besdin doesn't even allow him in the first place, because they don't want to take that responsibility and trust him to do anything, and therefore they say, leave it. If the owner didn't of his own make any arrangements, we're not going to step in, and therefore we have to monitor and we have to take care. No, we don't want any part of that. That's baked into the machlokes here as to inherently why you should or shouldn't allow, in the case of abandoned property, because there is the havamina that he may come back, because there's no rumor of his death. He just picked himself up. He didn't tell anybody where he's going, and he just left. Okay, I mean, it happens. It happens. Now, when we see what the underlying facts are, because we'll say that in a minute. We're just making an assumption he picked himself up and left, and he didn't tell anybody. So hold the thought, and we'll see exactly what this means. Now,
one other thing, which is that there's, and maybe we'll get to this too, but which is that there's so many different possibilities here. What we were talking about a few weeks ago was specifically a situation of it's harvest time. The stuff's already sitting there. It's already been maybe already been harvested, or it's about to be harvested, and now it's a question of, do you sell it before it goes moldy, kind of a thing. Right. Here now we're talking about, this expands though to situations where it could be the owner planted the stuff and then left for a short trip, but he's not back yet, and maybe he died, maybe he's okay, just couldn't make it, the boat get back here, etc. And we don't know how long it's going to be. And it could be even the other end. Starts at harvest time, fine, that's clear that you want to go ahead and take care of that and sell the stuff, keep a small amount as a salary, etc. Right. But now we come around, we go through the winter, and now it's time to plant again in the spring. That's a lot of effort. Do you go ahead and get started on that, or do you know if the owner would have wanted you to do? So many different possibilities.
Many possibilities, exactly. And so the Gemara is not honing in on any one; it's just giving us a more general a context in which to look at this. But now let's just say the next piece, and then maybe pull some of these things together. So we talked about. And someone goes into the possession of a property of a shvuyim, of a shavui, and then we talked about natushim. Says the Gemara, there's a third alternative. Hayored lenichse retushim. If someone goes into the property of a retushim, and that's a pasuk in the Torah, we'll see that in a minute. What is retushim? So retushim is by definition also abandoned property, right? Motzian osamayada. Says the brisa there that if it goes into the retushim, you take it out of his hand. What is retushim? Elahe nichse retushim, says the Gemara. Now listen carefully. Aviv or Achiv or Echad ben Amarishan, the same category of people. Khan, they're here. You see them. They're walking around. And then one day you come out to the property and they left. So in other words, they were here and now they're gone. So it's a little bit different than the case of the Netushim, where if we look at the actual definition, we know that they went to Medinas Hayam. In the case of the Netushim, they went to, as in the case of Shvuyim, they went to Medinas Hayam. Everybody said goodbye, you're on a ship, you go into Medinas Hayam, and they did not designate anything. The Retushin, overnight, the guy's gone. There was no ship, there was nothing left. All of a sudden, he's gone. So that's a different Metzias. We'll see in a minute. So now we have three categories. We have Shvuyin, we have Netushim, which is abandoned, and we have Ritushim, which is also abandoned. So, okay, definition. Frek the Gemara right away. My Shno Hanach, the Korle Netushim, my Shno Hanach, the Korle Ritushim. What are you telling me here? We have Shvuyim and abandonment. What is this new abandonment that you're telling me? We're here one day and not the next. So let's look at Rashi first. Ulakamen mefarish lahu retushim mashma she'ozva balim bedata, that they did it intentionally. V'holchu lahem the kivan dahayalo litzabas, since they should have directed or commanded what to do with the property because they had plenty of time. Haridu yarshal nichse v'lo tziva, and they didn't direct. Shema mina lo nichale. It's shema mina that they don't want anybody there. The netushim shenatashim ba'aleim bal karchan. However, netushim, which was ba'al karcha, they had to abandon the property. So now he's going to go back and define that. They're going shenishba bahana tanoi the Rab Shimon sava maridin v'rabbanan sava ein maridin. So now, by understanding retushim, we go back and we understand what netushim is. Netushim is forced abandonment. He didn't have the time. We thought netushim was abandonment, and he had the time to designate. Therefore, says Rashi, that we don't allow it, but once he's in, we allow it. Wait a minute, that's not what netushim is. Netushim is forced abandonment, and retushim is voluntary abandonment. What's the difference? The difference is, does he have time to designate a yoresh? Does he have time to designate? So now we have three categories: the category of shvuyin, the category of netushim, where a person has no choice, and the category of retushim, where he has a choice. So that we have three categories, and what do we do with those three categories? So let's just continue, and then we'll go back and explain all of it. So correct the Gemara Ma'ishna. What's the difference between netushim and retushim? So Lamed Tesam and Aleph. Let's go to the top of the Aleph. We say netushim debal korcha. Netushim means that it was forced, or he did it because he had no choice. What's a classic example of that? The Kosuv v'hashvius tishmetena v'not tashta. What does it say by shvius? That on the seventh year you have to abandon it. Tishmetena v'not tashta. That's netushin, notashta. So what are you supposed to do? Says the Gemara, Avkate the Malka. The queen, the king, the Rabbeinu Shalom says, abandon the property. So you were forced to abandon the property, the netushim, and you have no choice. Says Rashi, netushim al karcha diksiva shvius tishmetena natashta haina al karcha avkata demalka. Okay, mitzvah hamelech. So now we understand netushim a little bit different. Netushim doesn't just mean he woke up one day and he picked himself up and he left. Yeah, sure, that's an example, but to understand netushim, you have to understand that netushim was bal karcha. He had no choice. Therefore, it makes sense to say when Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that netushim kishvuyin is because it's out of your hands. You have no choice in the matter. Retushim, however, retushim the medaton, that is with forethought, with intent. Diksiv, what's the pasuk? He brings down the pasuk from Hosea. Aim alabonim rotsha. There's a discussion in that the Navi brings down that the village was afraid they were going to be attacked. So if they're going to be attacked, then they have to start making plans. So what do? They start packing, and they say, we're going to leave so that when the attack comes, we're not going to be in harm's way. That's with a forethought. That's an example of someone who thinks it through, and that's retushim. Rotsha, use the word rotsha. They abandon it, but abandonment there doesn't mean you're forced to abandon. And then there's a Rashi here, the very long Rashi, Ahainu midato. It's with a forethought, v'lo shavi, and it's not like a captive. Diksiv reisha dekra, where it says in the beginning of the pasuk, "V'kam shom ba'amecha ha'yureim." They were afraid shlo yavu. They were afraid shlo yavu or yavim aleim, that their enemy wouldn't Oiveim would come onto them. They went into Golas. They left over the cities. It was empty from any people. So someone based on Ravavel Mulchama, Ushadadin Haborn Mulchama Aliday Ma'arev. All right, he goes on. El Amha Yoshev B'Shalom. Shalom Haru Bahem Levroach. In other words, he's saying that if it's settled and it's peaceful, then no one thinks of leaving because everything is shalom v'shalva. And then he brings down from Yirmiyahu, Hegla Yehuda kula hagolach shlumim mitoch yeshiva shalom boy and machrid heglam Nebuchadnezzar. So they began, everything was shalom, and then they were afraid of the galus of Nebuchadnezzar. Beis Harav Avil Targum Yonison Beis Ma'arev Aleph Lamed Yisorim Bo Kamo Yanu Es Yazriel Shuloshin Zriel Lo Loshin Ear B'Dikaoma Yushad Kishud Shalman Beis Harav Meklal to have a Yoma Lav Beis Harav Beyond Mulchama. All right, I don't have all the Lashonis here. Ela Marach Ba Belibam, they were afraid in their heart. The Hema Ozvin, so they ran away. Aim Alabonim, Vaholchem Lahem Midoika Oyev, because of the worry of the Oyev, Shema Yavalem. Okay, so what Rashi is really telling us in great detail, bringing down these psukim, is that, and maybe we have to do a little study on the Navi. I have to go into the Navi and look at more carefully. But basically, what Rashi is telling us is that the word Rotsha, which is used in the Pasuk in Hosea, means they ran away, they abandoned it, and Rotsha, they did it because they were afraid. So in other words, they had the time to look and to see that the matzav was not good, as opposed to Shvius, where you have no choice. I mean, you're living fine on the land, everything is good, and you know Shvius is coming, and you have to abandon it. You have no choice but to abandon it. So that's the chilik he wants to make. So now, and we want to carry that forward to our Gemara, where we talk about Shvuyin and Netushim and Retushim, not in the context of the Rabbeinu Shalom, with Shvius and all of that, but whether or not a person had the forethought to appoint someone or not. So the Gemara is telling us that where there was not the opportunity to appoint, we can't assume that he didn't want to have a shomer or someone. So therefore, the Netushim means that we allow him in because it wasn't something that he would have necessarily been opposed. Retushim, because he had plenty of time, by definition, the word Rotsha means he did it voluntarily. There, the Gemara says we don't allow anybody to come in. So now we have, and therefore, Rav Shimon Gamliel, the Machlokes Tanoim is that the Tanna Kama says that Shvuyim you're allowed to have him in, Netushim and Rishuyim you're not. And Rav Shimon Gamliel comes and says Netushim, that Netushim is like a Shvuyim where you allow him in, and therefore we're not worried that he's going to destroy the land. But Retushim, we don't allow him in because by Retushim, we really do have a concern that he may destroy the land, in which case we don't want it. And Rashi says, Rotsha is Nezava, he left it open. All right, so this is the three-part, this is the machlokes of the three properties, but we see there is a machlokes Tanoim. That's what the Gemara wanted to tell us. There's a machlokes Tanoim between the Tanoim of our Mishnah, the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon Gamliel. And according to the Rabbanan, you may not enter. That's what they say in our Mishnah as well. And according to Shimon Gamliel, you are allowed to enter into Netushim, but not into Ritushim. So that's our machlokes. So now the Gemara wants to go a step further. And the Gemara says, okay, Roger, Tana v'kulam. So the Brisa there says the word v'kulam, and on all of them, meaning that anybody who comes into the property, right, shaman lahem ka'aris, that in the worst event, anybody who comes in to take care of the property is treated like an aris. He's treated like a sharecropper, and therefore will allow him in because he won't destroy. Frank the Gemara, ahai, what is this Gemara of a kulam referring to? Remember, we have shvuyim and netushim and ritushim. So you're telling me that the kulam in all of them, shaman lahem ka'aris, that if he comes in, we treat him like an aris. Why is he an aris? Because he knows that worst comes to worst, he'll get paid. So he's not going to destroy the property. Frank the Gemara, high. What does it go on? If you're telling me that the kulam allows him to come into shvuyin property, hashtazaras v'nishker hava. We just said earlier that in the case of shvuyin, he's allowed to jump in and harvest the whole thing before the guy comes back. So what are you telling me, that we're going to treat him like a sharecropper? He's one better than a sharecropper. He took upon himself ownership, that he owns the property. He went in, he was a Zoriz, he did it quickly, Benishkar, and he harvested the whole thing, and he took the whole thing. So what are you telling me? The Kulam are going to treat him like an Oris? He's far better than an Oris. He's taken over the whole thing. What are you telling me, that he's going to get paid like an Oris? Of course he's not going to get paid like an Oris, because he took the whole thing right away. And the Gemara said earlier that he's allowed to do that.
Does he have an obligation to inform the Besdin of what he's doing?
No. He's there and he can do what he wants to do. The Besdin right now sort of gave up control. So when he comes in and they allow him in, they're going to assume he's taking care. But here he's taking care by taking everything for himself, and they allow it. So you want to tell me, oh, don't worry, he's going to get paid like a sharecropper. The sharecropper, let's say, gets 25% of the produce. He took 100% of the produce because he jumped up and said, you know what? I'm harvesting this whole thing for myself. Even though I know he's coming back, I'm allowed to do it.
But the Besdin had no responsibility.
No responsibility.
Watch
No.
that feel that the owner was away.
No, exactly right. The Besdin had no responsibility. Once they allowed him in, they gave him full reshus, and he said, okay, this is what I'm doing. I don't have to ask permission. This is what I'm doing. So the Gemara says that's not what the kulam can mean. It can't go on Shavuyin, because Shavuyin, he doesn't need to be a sharecropper. He can be a full owner and take everything. Elo are retushim. So now the Gemara jumps and says, maybe it means retushim, right? Then it goes on retushim. And it says that we take it out of his hands. So what do you mean you're going to give him he's going to treat it like a sharecropper? Everybody admits that by retushim, we don't allow him in. So you can't say v'kulam, that they all agree that he can be a sharecropper by retushim, because retushim by definition doesn't allow him in. So Ella, says the Gemara, we have only one other option. On netushin, it must refer to the forced abandonment, netushin, laman. So according to who? Remember, there's a machlokes Rabbanan and Rav Shimon Gamliel. So according to who does that Gemara apply? Ilay Rabbanan. If you say it's netushin, but according to the Rabbanan, ha'amru matzin osem miyado, the rabbis themselves also said by netushin we don't allow. That was the machlokes tanoim between the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon Gamliel. The Rabbanan said we don't allow. By retushim, everybody says you don't allow. But by netushim, we had a machlokes between Rabbanan and Rav Shimon Gamliel. Rabbanan says you don't let him in. Rav Shimon Gamliel says you do let him in. So if the Brisa say b'kulam, but by all of them you allow him to be an oris, it can't be the Rabbanan, because the Rabbanan never let him in by netushin, right? So Ilem Rabbanan ha'amar matzino semiyado. Rav Shimon Gamliel. So you're going to say it's netushin, but according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, ha'amar shamati shanetushim kishvuyim. Rabbi Gamliel himself said that I heard, and my shita is that netushim is like shvuyin. And if netushim is like shvuyin, what do we say by shvuyin? You're allowed to take the whole thing. If you're allowed to take the whole thing, then what's pshat v'kulam and all of them? He can be an oris. The Gemara is trying to figure out under what circumstance will he be a sharecropper. And we said that by shvuyin he can't be. You can't say it because he's allowed to have the whole thing. By retushim it can't be because he's not allowed to come in according to anybody. By netushim he can't come in according to the Rabbanan. That's out. But he can come in according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. But according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, not only can he come in, but he can take the whole thing. So what's pshat when the Gemara says v'kulam that in all of them he can be a sharecropper? When can he be a sharecropper? There's not a metzias where he can be satisfied with being a sharecropper. It's either all or nothing. According to the Rabbanan, it's always nothing, and according to Shimon Gamliel, it's either nothing or everything, but not halfway where he's a sharecropper. So that's the kasha. So shamati shanetushim kishvuyin. So what's the answer? Says the Gemara, kishvuyin v'lo kishvuyin. That according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, it is like shvuyin, but it's not like shvuyin. What do we mean? Kishvuyin de'ein metzion osem miyado. It's like shvuyin that we don't kick him out. A metzion osem miyado means we let him in the property. Below shvuyin, but it's not shvuyin. The Elohosam Zor V'Nishkar. There, if he hurries and he does it, we don't allow him to keep it. So now we have a distinction of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says by shvuyin, he's allowed to jump in and harvest everything, and we can't say a word because we gave him full permission and he came in. However, by netushim, albeit Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says you allow him in, but we allow him in to be a sharecropper, an orus. We don't allow him in to take the whole thing. So when the Brisa says v'kulon shamaleka oris, that everybody allows him to be a oris, that only applies to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel by netushim. So there is a comparison between shvuyim and netushim, but only to the extent that we allow him in. Once he's in, says Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, he doesn't have the same rights as a shvuyim. Shvuyim can take the whole thing and not worry, and the netushim can only be treated like a orus and can't take the whole thing. So that's how the Gemara wants to answer the machlokes and tell us that at the end of the day, this discussion that we had that was started last week and going to this week is a machlokes, not just the Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel and the others. It's a machlokes Tanoim. We always like to go back to the original source. If we can't find a source, we say, okay, it's a machlokes Amoraim, and okay, that's the dispute. But if we can tie a machlokes to going back another generation to the Tanoim, we try to do that. So the Gemara here wants to say, not only is it a machlokes Amoraim, it's a machlokes Tanoim, just like our Mishnah is a machlokes Tanoim between the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon Gamliel, so too that Brisa, which is like a Mishnah, that Brisa is also a machlokes Tanoim between the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon Gamliel as to whether or not A, you're going to allow him in, and B, if you allow him in, what rights? And Jay, this kind of goes to your question, is is it hefker? No, it's not hefker. The Beis Din does have some shlita, but they don't micromanage it to the point where once he's in, now you're gonna have to report to us every day. That's not gonna happen. But the basic question is the Beis Din going to allow him in or not? And once it allows him in, they say, oh, we trust you that you're going to do the right thing in the property.
Does the Beis Din trust him that as a sharecropper, he'll do the right thing?
Yes, because they say that he knows he's going to get paid, so he won't be a chazer. He's not going to try to destroy the property and grab it all out, because after all, a sharecropper gets nicely paid. It's not as if they're going to say, thank you very much for your service, get off my property. A sharecropper is a valued person who gets paid. He's not a Yairish. He doesn't take over the property, but he's handsomely paid. So the question was, do we worry that he's going to say sharecropping is not enough for me? I need the whole 100, everything. And that's the machlokes. So that was the machlokes also between Rav and Shmuel as to whether or not human nature will kick in, and he'll say, you know what, I'm not a chazer. I get paid like an oris. I'm happy. I'll be okay. So basically, that's how the Gemara comes out and says that we now have a machlokes Tanoim, but the machlokes Tanoim is that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel allows you to come in netushin, but doesn't give you the full breadth of the property as it does with shvuyim, and you still can only be a sharecropper. So that's how the Gemara comes out the maskana.
Rabbi, there's this little problem with the using the analogy of shvius for netushim because of the lashon there. God commanded you to abandon it, but you retain equal rights to whatever grows there. Nobody else can come in or say you can't use it. You can use the fruits, they can use the fruits, but nobody can come in and work the land. That issue of who's going to, keep the land up doesn't come up because nobody's allowed to do that.
Right. So keep in mind that they only use that pasuk to define netushim. It's not as if that's the actual example in our Gemara. The Gemara wants us to understand what is netushim. What does it mean? You know what it means? It means forced abandonment as in the case of Shvius. But that's it. We're not talking about Shvius anymore. Now we're talking about our case of Netushim, where he went in because it was forced abandonment. You're 100% right, David, that Shvius is a whole different story, and he can't come in. But we use it only for the purpose of understanding the word, just like in Netushim, we use that pasuk in Hosea to say that it's abandoned, but it wasn't it was voluntarily abandoned. So you're right there. But as far as Netushim is concerned, the principle of Netushim is I can it's abandoned and I can go in. So let's
Rabbi, de facto, how does this carried out? So does he in effect escrow this money that he gets, and the Beis Din allots him a portion if the halachas Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and then he's
exactly
a
right.
sharecropper?
Right. So the property may yield $1,000, and he's allowed 25%. Let's just say, but whatever so they say 25% is you, and the other 75% belongs to the owner. But you did a good job because you sold it, so it's not going to be destroyed. At least the owner will get some money out of it. Exactly. Right. So they're the Beis Din. Once he's a sharecropper, the Beis Din does sort of get into intercede. Says Rashi, the kulam, mefarish lakame ahai koi. What does it go on? The klala la'asumai. What is this word the kulam? By the way, we're gonna next week we're gonna hit this word again. But for now, the word v'kulam, when it says all of them, what does it mean? Yeah, shaman leika aris im yavo habalin yitlu elu b'shevach kakos uperis kamine garise hamoka. And so it means that when the balim come, this sharecropper will take. The way they get paid is, I think, on the value of the improvement of the karka, he gets a percentage, and whatever the minig was, 25%, 30%, whatever the minig was, and he's comfortable that he knows that that's what's going to happen. So he doesn't jump in and say, I got to rip this land apart and get what I can because I'm not going to get anything. Hashda zor is v'nish b'hava v'yitl hakol, right? Because that's what we said by Shvuyim, that he can jump in and he can take everything. Okay, so let's stop because this Rashi will go to the next sugya. So basically, that's how the Gemara ends over here. Now, so the next week we're going to ask another kasha because we're not satisfied. The Gemara is totally satisfied with the answer. So the Gemara is going to ask another question based on another Mishnah. So we'll hold that for next week. But for now, I think we've sort of come to some understanding in the machlokes between the Rabban and the Tanakama in this case, and Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Again, you see, and it's fascinating because we have a system. I mean, we live in a more everything is systematized. We understand what we're doing, whether our halacha, common law, whatever, imposes certain requirements of us. It would seem, and I know that, Jay, you ask these questions a lot because they're valid, is at the time of the Gemara, it was not so centralized. Yes, the Beis Din said, yeah, we're going to oversee it, and you go ahead and do it. But we're not going to micromanage you. We're not going to, see, what you're doing at every step of the way. We trust you. And if we're going to allow you to do it, then we're going to allow you to sort of, again, in the case of Netushim, be a good guy, work the land, get paid, take the money, bring it back to Beis Din, and when the guy comes back, he'll get paid. So obviously there was a trust factor, but that's how things operated. So if we think of our system today and try to impose it at the time of the Gemara, it won't work because we are much more maybe rule oriented, or we have a definition of the rules. The Beis Din didn't have that. The Beis Din just made sort of general statements, and people followed. It was quote an ehrliche society.
Yeah.
People followed, right? I mean, otherwise, but you see where they allowed some leeway. You see that they allowed some people to grab it all. In other words, I'm not such a, okay, I have an opportunity, I'm going to jump and do the whole thing. Not everybody was a gentleman and said, I'm going to be an oris and let the other guy have the benefit of his produce. No, some people didn't, but that was the system. That was the system. Today, we do have more rules. Today, if there was a rule and someone violated the rule, he's punished. You're not allowed to take 100%. You're only allowed to take 30, 40, whatever it happens to be. So that's what we have to keep in mind when we learn this Gemara, or any Gemara, is that is how the Beis Din operated, that we think of this Beis Din as this all-powerful central authority, but it was more of a guideline than it was a sort of a superimposed, this is what you have to do, and everything else. But look, they expected people to comply, to be menschlich, but it is what it is. Anyway, all right, so Mitzvah Shem, next week we'll pick it up.